When Vanessa Whitmore's divorce was finalized, her ex-husband Gregory told their mutual friends, more than once, that she would have to figure out how to survive on her own now, a sentence he delivered with a specific kind of satisfaction that several people who heard it have since described as difficult to forget. He had no idea that the woman he was describing as someone about to struggle was worth $3.8 billion dollars and had been the entire time he knew her. Vanessa Whitmore had spent 11 years of marriage and 15 years before that, presenting herself to nearly everyone in her adult life as a moderately successful interior design consultant, a believable, unremarkable identity that concealed her actual position as the sole surviving heir to Whitmore Maritime Logistics, a shipping and freight empire her father built over 4 decades. She had done this deliberately. She had done it for reasons that had nothing to do with Gregory specifically, and that went back decades before she ever met him. This is the story of why a billionaire heiress chose to live an entire decade of her adult life as someone else, what it cost her to maintain that choice through a marriage and a divorce, and what happened when a single photograph, taken at an event she could no longer avoid, finally made the truth impossible to keep contained. It is also, by the end, the story of what Brianna Castellanos said when she saw that photograph for the first time, a reaction so immediate and so widely discussed that it became on its own one of the most replayed moments connected to this entire story. Vanessa's father had a specific rule that governed her entire childhood, one she had never broken in 39 years until the exact week this story is about to show you. The rule had a name inside the family. They called it the Whitmore Standard. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what the Whitmore Standard actually was, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, why would someone worth billions choose to live as though she had almost nothing? This is not a story about a woman who lost her fortune and had to rebuild. Vanessa never lost anything. She built an entire decade-long structure specifically designed to make sure no one around her, including the man she married, ever found out what she actually had. We're going to show you exactly why. Second, did Gregory ever suspect anything? 11 years is a long time to live beside someone without noticing inconsistencies. We're going to walk through exactly what Gregory saw, what he dismissed, and what he actively chose not to investigate, because the explanation he had already settled on was simply more comfortable for him to believe. And third, what was the photograph and how did it finally surface? Vanessa had successfully avoided this exact outcome for over a decade. We're going to show you the one event she could not avoid, the one photograph she could not control, and the specific stretch of time during which an entire, carefully maintained identity came apart in public. One more thing before we go back to the beginning. Brianna Castellanos' first words upon seeing that photograph, according to 3 separate people present in the room at the time, were not about the money at all. They were about something Vanessa had said to her months earlier that Brianna had completely misunderstood until that exact moment. Edward Whitmore built Whitmore Maritime Logistics from a single leased cargo vessel in 1979 into one of the largest privately held freight and shipping conglomerates on the East Coast. A company that, by the time of his death, operated a fleet of 14 vessels and held long-term contracts with several Fortune 500 manufacturers. He did this almost entirely outside of public visibility, deliberately keeping the company privately held rather than public, specifically so that its finances and his own would never be subject to the kind of scrutiny he had watched destroy a close friend and fellow shipping executive decades earlier. That friend had gone through an extraordinarily public and humiliating divorce in the late 1980s, one that exposed his entire financial life to tabloid coverage and turned what should have been a private family matter into a years-long public spectacle that, in Edward's own words to a colleague at the time, cost him his dignity long after it had already cost him his marriage. Edward Whitmore resolved, watching that unfold, that no one in his own family would ever be vulnerable to the same exposure. The rule he established, and which his family came to refer to privately as the Whitmore Standard, was simple in its statement and demanding in its execution. No Whitmore family member would ever allow their wealth to become a defining or even visible fact of their identity outside of a small trusted circle, regardless of personal relationships, professional opportunities, or social pressure to do otherwise. Vanessa, his only child, was raised inside this standard from early childhood, attending public schools under a deliberately unremarkable version of the family name, and was taught consistently and explicitly that financial privacy was not paranoia. It was protection. Edward Whitmore died when Vanessa was 28. The Whitmore Standard did not die with him. If anything, in the years that followed, Vanessa adhered to it more completely than her father ever had. In the year following her father's death, Vanessa made a series of specific, deliberate decisions about how she would manage her position as the sole heir to a fortune that, after estate settlement, exceeded $3 billion. She retained Priscilla Oyalaran, her father's longtime estate attorney, to manage the formal legal and financial architecture of the Whitmore holdings through a structure of trusts and holding entities specifically designed to keep her name several legal steps removed from any public record search a casual observer, or even a moderately motivated one, might reasonably conduct. Vanessa enrolled under her full legal name, but without any public connection drawn to the Whitmore fortune, in a graduate certificate program in interior design, a field she had genuine talent and interest in, and built over the following several years an entirely legitimate, moderately successful design consulting practice that served as both authentic professional work and a complete, sustainable explanation for her income, her schedule, and her lifestyle. One that required no fabrication at all because the practice itself was real. This detail matters considerably according to people who have studied the case since it became public. Vanessa's deception was not built on lies in the conventional sense. It was built on a true, functioning professional identity that simply omitted an enormous and separate fact about her life, maintained through structures specifically designed to make that omission durable rather than fragile. It was in this carefully constructed, deliberately ordinary life that Vanessa met Gregory Marsh at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend who, like nearly everyone else in Vanessa's life at that point, had no idea who she actually was. Gregory Marsh was, at the time he met Vanessa, a regional sales director for a mid-sized commercial equipment distributor, ambitious and ascending steadily within his industry, with a specific and frequently stated belief that he intended to marry someone who would complement and support that ascent. Vanessa, presenting as a design consultant with a comfortable but unremarkable income, fit a profile Gregory found appealing for reasons that, in retrospect, he has had to sit with considerably more discomfort than he initially anticipated. Friends of the couple from this period have consistently described the early relationship as genuinely warm, with Vanessa, by multiple accounts, deeply enjoying the experience of being valued for qualities entirely separate from money for what may have been the first sustained period in her adult life, a dynamic she has since described in limited public comments as the part of the marriage she has the least complicated feelings about, even now. Gregory proposed after 18 months of dating, and the wedding, intentionally modest by Vanessa's design, was attended by approximately 60 guests, funded entirely by what appeared to be Vanessa's design consulting income, and a reasonable contribution from Gregory himself, a financial picture that, to every guest present, looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like: a comfortable, unremarkable, happy young couple beginning a life together. 11 years later, that same modest wedding would become one of the most discussed and re-examined events of the entire story. Once people understood exactly who had actually paid for significantly more of it than anyone realized at the time. Maintaining the concealment across 11 years of marriage required specific, ongoing structural choices that Vanessa, by her own later account, found both manageable and, at times, genuinely exhausting. The couple lived modestly relative to Vanessa's actual means, in a comfortable but unremarkable home that Vanessa purchased, through a holding entity managed by Priscilla Oyalaran, using funds that were structured to appear on any document Gregory might reasonably encounter as a conventional mortgage. Vanessa's actual wealth was managed entirely through trust structures and investment vehicles that generated no income directly traceable to her personal accounts in ways that would have been visible on the couple's shared tax filings, beyond what looked to Gregory like reasonably successful design consulting income, supplemented by modest personal investments. A level of financial sophistication Gregory, by his own later admission, simply assumed was beyond what either of them needed to think about closely, since their lifestyle never demanded closer scrutiny. Several specific moments over the 11 years came close to exposing the truth, according to people close to the couple. Vanessa attended exactly 2 Whitmore Maritime board-adjacent functions during the marriage, both described to Gregory as work events for a design client, a characterization that was technically defensible since Vanessa had in fact done legitimate design consulting work for properties connected to the company without ever disclosing that she herself controlled the company in question. Gregory did notice things over the years that did not entirely add up. What he did with those observations is the part of this story that, once it became public, generated the most pointed criticism directed at him personally. Friends of the marriage have described independently and consistently a pattern in which Gregory occasionally encountered details that sat slightly outside the financial picture he had constructed in his mind. An unusually generous anonymous donation Vanessa once mentioned, making to a cause she cared about. A level of comfort with certain expensive purchases that seemed, on occasion, mildly inconsistent with a design consultant's typical income. A noticeable deference some service professionals showed Vanessa that Gregory privately found puzzling but never directly questioned. A close friend of Gregory's from this period has since described, in an account given after the story became public, a specific conversation in which Gregory acknowledged noticing some things that didn't quite track about Vanessa's finances, but had decided, in his own words at the time, that he didn't want to seem like the kind of guy who audits his wife, a framing that allowed him to avoid both the discomfort of asking and the deeper discomfort of what the answer might actually reveal about the power dynamics in his own marriage. This detail matters enormously to how the story is understood once the truth comes out, because it establishes that Gregory's eventual humiliation was not purely the result of Vanessa's skill at concealment. It was also, in part, the predictable consequence of his own specific incuriosity, a choice not to look closely at a picture that was, by his own later admission, already showing him edges that did not quite fit, because the comfortable story he had already settled into required him not to look. That comfortable story survived completely intact for 11 years. It began to unravel in the final 18 months of the marriage, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with money at all. By the 9th year of the marriage, Vanessa and Gregory's relationship had begun showing strain that, by every account from people close to the couple, had nothing to do with money or hidden identities at all, and everything to do with a more ordinary and common set of pressures. Gregory's career had plateaued in ways that frustrated him considerably, and he had begun, according to several friends, directing a portion of that frustration toward Vanessa in the form of increasingly frequent criticism about her career's modest scale compared to his own ambitions for where he believed their household income should be. Gregory complained on multiple documented occasions to mutual friends that Vanessa's design consulting work would never generate the kind of financial security he wanted for their future, and suggested more than once that she consider a more conventional and higher-earning career path. Criticism Vanessa absorbed, according to the same friends, with a composure that several people found slightly unusual in retrospect, once they understood what she actually could have said in response at any point. Vanessa has said in limited subsequent comments that this period was professionally and personally difficult for reasons separate from the financial criticism itself. She genuinely valued her design work, found Gregory's dismissiveness about it hurtful independent of any irony involved, and has said the hardest part of staying silent during this specific period was not protecting a financial secret, but absorbing criticism about a professional identity that was, in every way that mattered to her personally, completely real and meaningful. It was during this exact period of strain that Gregory met Brianna Castellano at a regional sales conference neither he nor Vanessa initially treated as significant. Gregory's relationship with Brianna Castellano, a marketing manager for a competing equipment distributor whom he met at an industry conference, began as a professional acquaintance and escalated over approximately 14 months into an emotional and eventually physical affair that Gregory has since acknowledged. In divorce proceedings, began well before he and Vanessa formally separated. Brianna, by consistent account from people who knew her professionally during this period, was ambitious, socially confident, and explicitly interested, according to a former close friend who later distanced herself from Brianna after the affair became known, in building a life that looked a certain way, a description that would take on considerable additional irony once the full picture of Vanessa's actual wealth became public. Vanessa became aware of the affair approximately 8 months before the divorce was formally filed, through a combination of change patterns in Gregory's schedule and eventually a direct admission from Gregory himself when confronted. Her response, according to people close to her during this period, was notably calm and procedurally focused rather than dramatically emotional, a composure that several friends attributed, at the time, simply to Vanessa's general temperament, without understanding that she had, by that point, already begun quietly engaging Priscilla Oylaran to manage the practical complexities the divorce was about to create. Those complexities were considerable and almost entirely invisible to Gregory throughout the entire process that followed. Vanessa's central challenge during the divorce was not simply emotional, but structurally complex in a way few divorces ever are. She needed to finalize a legal separation from Gregory without triggering the kind of financial discovery process that would typically apply to a marital estate, while remaining within the bounds of family law disclosure requirements that legally obligated her to report her actual assets and income. Priscilla Oyalaran structured Vanessa's formal financial disclosures around the assets and income that were, in fact, directly and personally hers in the conventional sense. Her design consulting business, her personal bank accounts, and her direct ownership interests, while the vast majority of the Whitmore fortune remained legally held within multi-generational trust structures that Vanessa was a beneficiary of rather than a direct owner. A distinction that, under the relevant state's family law framework, meant those trust assets were not considered part of the marital estate subject to division or even, in most respects, formal disclosure in the proceeding, since they had been established years before the marriage and Vanessa had not contributed marital funds to them. This structure was, according to family law experts who have since reviewed the case, almost certainly entirely legal, a sophisticated but unremarkable use of pre-existing trust law that wealthy families commonly employ, made unusual in this case only by the scale involved and the fact that Gregory had no idea any of it existed to even ask about. Gregory's own attorney, lacking any specific reason to suspect undisclosed wealth on this scale, did not pursue the kind of aggressive forensic financial discovery that might, in a case where one party already suspected something, have uncovered at least some trace of the broader Whitmore connection. The Post received significant engagement within days, in part because several of Gregory's specific comments about Vanessa's career and finances, made to mutual friends during and after the marriage, had been documented and were quoted directly, giving the story a level of verified specificity that similar viral relationship stories often lack. Vanessa herself made no public comment during this period, maintaining, even as the story spread considerably beyond her control, the same disciplined privacy that had defined her entire adult life. Gregory, by contrast, made one specific public comment during this period that significantly worsened, rather than improved, how the story was received. A comment several people have since described as the single biggest unforced error of the entire saga. Approximately 1 week after the story began circulating, Gregory responded to a direct message from an acquaintance asking whether the story was true with a public comment, screenshot, and subsequently shared widely, in which he characterized Vanessa's concealment as deeply manipulative and stated that he deserved to know the truth throughout the marriage. A framing that, once public, generated immediate and pointed pushback from a large number of people following the story. Commentators and casual observers following the story pointed out with consistency and considerable specificity that Vanessa's concealment of her own personal wealth, accumulated and structured before the marriage and never claimed against Gregory's own finances or efforts, was meaningfully different from the kind of deception that typically merits the word manipulative, and that Gregory's framing conveniently ignored his own documented pattern of criticizing Vanessa's career and finances throughout the marriage. behavior that looked considerably worse in light of the actual facts than it had looked at the time. Several commentators specifically noted the irony that Gregory's complaint amounted, in substance, to frustration that his wife had not disclosed wealth that, under virtually any reasonable interpretation of the situation, was never going to be shared with him regardless of disclosure, since it predated the marriage entirely and remained legally and structurally separate from it throughout, meaning his actual grievance was less about deception and more about the specific discomfort of having spent years condescending to someone who had simply never corrected him. Vanessa, when asked by a journalist covering the story's online spread for any response to Gregory's characterization, provided a single brief statement that ended up being quoted more widely than almost anything else connected to the entire saga. Vanessa's statement, provided once to a single journalist and never expanded upon afterward, despite considerable continued public interest, read in full, "I did not hide who I was to deceive Gregory specifically. I hid it because my father taught me that the world treats visible wealth as an invitation to be used, and I wanted, at least once in my life, to be loved or criticized for reasons that had nothing to do with money I did not earn myself. I got both, completely honestly, for 11 years. I don't regret the choice even now. I only regret that it apparently mattered more to him what I had than who I was, the entire time we were married, and neither of us ever had to find that out until it was already over." Communications analysts and casual commentators alike noted that the statement's specific final sentence, that Gregory's reaction revealed something about his own priorities throughout the marriage, regardless of what Vanessa had concealed, reframed the entire story for a significant portion of the audience following it, shifting the narrative away from a simple story about a secret and toward a more pointed question about whether Gregory's retrospective outrage said more about Vanessa's deception or about his own assumptions all along. The statement also contained one detail that initially passed with relatively little public attention, but which became considerably more significant once the full picture of Vanessa's activity during the marriage came into focus. A passing reference to work she was already doing quietly, the entire time, that had nothing to do with either of them. In the years following her father's death, alongside building her genuine design consulting practice and maintaining her marriage to Gregory, Vanessa had been quietly directing a substantial portion of Whitmore Family Trust distributions toward a maritime workforce development foundation she had established under a name with no public connection to the Whitmore family at all, funding vocational training and continuing education programs for dock workers, freight logistics employees, and maritime trade workers across several East Coast port communities, the same population of working people her father's company had employed for decades. By the time the story became public, the foundation had funded vocational training for an estimated 11,000 workers across 6 states, operating with a board of directors and program staff who knew Vanessa only by a working pseudonym she used specifically for this purpose, a layer of concealment she maintained even within her own philanthropic work, separate from and in addition to the personal concealment she maintained within her marriage. Priscilla Oyalaran, when asked directly why Vanessa had maintained this additional, seemingly unnecessary layer of secrecy, even within charitable work that most wealthy donors would have been eager to publicly attach their name to, has said Vanessa's reasoning was consistent with the broader Whitmore Standard her father had instilled. She didn't want the workers in those programs to ever feel like they were receiving charity from a billionaire. She wanted them to feel like the opportunity was simply there, available, the way it should have been available to begin with, without anyone owing gratitude to a name attached to it. This detail, once it became widely known, did more to reshape public perception of Vanessa than the original wealth revelation had, for a specific and somewhat unexpected reason. Once the scale and structure of Vanessa's foundation work became public, the broader narrative around the story shifted considerably in ways that several commentators following the story noted explicitly. The initial framing centered on a dramatic wealth concealment twist with Gregory as an unwitting and somewhat humiliated party, gave way to a more complex and ultimately more favorable portrait of Vanessa specifically. A woman who had not simply hidden money for personal comfort or strategic advantage, but who had spent over a decade quietly directing extraordinary resources toward genuine, substantial public good, while asking for and receiving absolutely no public credit for any of it. Several maritime industry workers who had personally benefited from the Foundation's vocational programs came forward, once Vanessa's connection to the Foundation became known, to describe specific, concrete impacts the training had made in their own careers and financial stability. Testimonials that added a layer of tangible, human-scale impact to a story that had, until that point, been discussed primarily in terms of abstract numbers and relationship drama. Gregory's earlier public comment characterizing Vanessa as manipulative aged particularly poorly in light of this fuller picture, and several people who had initially been sympathetic to his sense of having been deceived found themselves reconsidering that sympathy considerably once the full scope of what Vanessa had actually done with her concealed position became clear. It was at this point, with public sentiment having shifted considerably, and the story having taken on a life well beyond the original couple, that Gregory made one final attempt to reach out to Vanessa directly, an attempt that did not go the way he had hoped. Gregory reached out to Vanessa approximately 3 weeks after the story's public attention had reached its peak, through a message relayed via Priscilla Oyalaran's office, requesting a single conversation that he characterized as an attempt to clear the air and understand things better. Vanessa agreed to a brief meeting held at Priscilla's office rather than any location with personal history attached to either of them. Gregory, according to Priscilla's later account, attempted to walk back his earlier public comments, characterizing them as having been said in shock, not really meaning it the way it came across, and asked somewhat directly whether Vanessa might consider some form of ongoing connection now that everything was out in the open anyway. Vanessa's response, according to the same account, was brief and entirely without hostility. She told him she appreciated him saying that she didn't hold the comments against him personally in any lasting way, but that she had spent 11 years being loved, or not loved, by someone who never actually knew the full truth of who she was, and she had no interest in finding out, now, whether anything might be different with the truth fully visible. She told him the meeting itself was the actual closure she had wanted, and that she didn't need anything further from him beyond that. Gregory left that meeting, according to Priscilla, without further argument, and has made no additional public comment about Vanessa or the situation since. Brianna and Gregory's relationship, strained considerably by the events of the preceding weeks, ended within 2 months of that meeting, for reasons that, according to mutual acquaintances, had primarily to do with Brianna's own difficulty processing what she had learned about her own initial reaction to the wealth revelation, and what that reaction had revealed to her about her own priorities. Vanessa, in the months that followed, did something with her newly public identity that very few people who had followed the story expected. With her identity now permanently and irreversibly public, Vanessa made a decision that surprised many people who assumed she would retreat into even greater privacy following the exposure she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. She chose, deliberately and with Priscilla Oyalaran's full support, to step into a public-facing role as president of the Maritime Workforce Foundation she had previously run anonymously, attaching her name and her resources to the work for the first time in its history. Vanessa has said, in the limited public comments she has made since taking on this role, that the decision was not about embracing visibility for its own sake, but about recognizing that the specific kind of privacy she had maintained for over a decade was no longer available to her regardless of her preferences, and that she would rather direct whatever public attention remained toward expanding work she genuinely believed in than simply manage an ongoing, losing effort to reclaim an anonymity that had already been permanently compromised. Under her public leadership, the Foundation's funding and program scope expanded considerably within the first year, drawing additional philanthropic partners who had previously had no visibility into the program's existence or impact. A practical benefit of the exposure that Vanessa has acknowledged, somewhat wryly, as the one part of all this she genuinely didn't expect to end up grateful for. Brianna Castellano, in the year following her relationship with Gregory's end, has been notably absent from public commentary about the story, declining several requests for interviews or statements. A former close friend has described her, in the time since, as having struggled considerably with the specific, public nature of her own misstep, that her initial dismissal of Vanessa's comment about the Whitmore side of the business became, against her own wishes, one of the most widely discussed and replayed details of the entire saga, a level of public scrutiny she had never sought and has found difficult to move past. The former friend noted that Brianna's stated interest throughout her relationship with Gregory in building a life that looked a certain way became, in the public retelling of the story, one of its most pointed and frequently repeated details, an irony Brianna has reportedly found considerably harder to escape than Gregory has found his own, since her specific words were quoted alongside the photograph that exposed everything, creating a permanent and easily searchable association she has had limited success distancing herself from. This story gets remembered when people share it as a story about a secret billionaire and the husband who never knew. And it is that. But I think the more interesting story underneath it is about the specific, complicated relationship between being loved and being known. Because Vanessa's entire adult experiment was built on a premise that turns out, once you sit with it, to be genuinely difficult to argue against. That money changes how people treat you so completely and so reliably that the only way to know whether someone actually values you, rather than your resources, is to remove the resources from the equation entirely, even at the cost of significant personal effort and a kind of structural loneliness most people never have to consider. And I think what makes this story more than a simple morality tale about Gregory's specific failures is the fact that Vanessa's experiment produced a genuinely ambiguous result, rather than a clean vindication. She got 11 years of being loved, imperfectly but apparently sincerely, for reasons unrelated to money. She also got 11 years of a husband who, once given a reasonable opportunity to investigate inconsistencies that might have led him toward the truth, consistently chose comfortable assumption over uncomfortable curiosity, which suggests, at minimum, that whatever Gregory loved about Vanessa, it was built on a foundation he never seemed especially motivated to examine closely, regardless of what he might have found. Vanessa's father built an entire family philosophy around the idea that wealth, made visible, becomes an instrument other people use against you. What this story ultimately suggests is something a little more specific and a little less comfortable. That wealth, made invisible, can become an instrument you unknowingly use to test the people around you, whether or not you ever intended it as a test. And that the answers such a test reveals, once they finally surface, are rarely simple enough to resolve into either complete vindication or complete regret. There's a photograph from the Foundation's first public gala, under Vanessa's own name, taken almost exactly 1 year after the photograph that first exposed her identity. In it, Vanessa stands on a stage in front of several hundred maritime workers and their families. Mid-applause, her expression caught somewhere between visible discomfort with the attention and a genuine, unguarded pride in what the room actually represented. She has said of that photograph that it is the first picture of herself taken in public in over a decade that she has not, at some point afterward, felt the specific and familiar urge to ask someone to take down. Before we go, I want to ask you something because I think this story raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and I'd rather hear your honest take than offer a tidy one myself. Vanessa got real answers about Gregory's character by removing her wealth from the equation for 11 years. But she also spent 11 years not fully known by the person she was married to and built an entire structure of secrecy that, however justified, meant no one in her daily life ever saw the complete picture of who she actually was. I want to ask you directly, do you think Vanessa's approach was a reasonable, even wise response to a real and valid fear about how wealth distorts relationships? Or do you think the cost of that much sustained concealment, even with good intentions behind it, is ultimately too high regardless of what it reveals about the people around you? Tell me where you land in the comments. I suspect the answer says something about how each of us weighs honesty against self-protection in our own lives. And if this story made you think about what you would actually want to know about the person you're building a life with, you'll want to see what we're covering next week. Because next week we're telling the story of a man who discovered, 4 years into his second marriage, that his new wife had been quietly in contact with his first wife's family the entire time, building a relationship he knew absolutely nothing about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We post a new true story every week. I'm your narrator. This has been Tales of Whisper. Sometimes the truest test of how someone sees you isn't what they say when they think you have everything. It's what they say when they're certain you have nothing at all. Tales of Whisper, storytelling for the curious mind.